Joining us is Alexander Vinnikov, the head of the NATO representation to Ukraine and director of the NATO liaison office to Ukraine, and Barbara Maronkova, director of the NATO Information and Documentation Center. So, thank you for coming in.
Our pleasure.
Good to be here.
So I was preparing for this interview, and there's so many topics that we could discuss. But the first one that came to my mind was several weeks ago, the Ukrainian parliament passed a bill to make NATO membership a foreign policy goal. How significant was that decision for your organisation?
Well, we take note of the decision by the Verkhovna Rada, but it's not up to us to comment on it. What I can tell you in general terms is that Ukraine has not applied for NATO membership. It currently has set itself an ambitious goal, which is to implement Euro-Atlantic standards and principles by 2020. And that is what NATO is committed to supporting Ukraine with. This is also the key focus for the NATO representation to Ukraine. Countries seeking NATO membership need to meet certain standards, standards of democracy, of good governance, rule of law, human rights, and market economy. So the focus really is right now on ensuring that Ukraine meets those standards through systemic reform. And it is those reforms that NATO leaders have commended Ukraine on and have also encouraged Ukraine to continue with implementing them without further ado.
Yeah, and that's interesting as well, because I would imagine that legislation is part of this big reform process. I mean, could you give me your analysis, as the NATO representative or the head of the representation in Ukraine, on the state of the reforms? What sort of progress has been made and what challenges lie ahead? At the NATO summit last year in Warsaw, heads of state and government commended Ukraine on having achieved significant progress in a number of areas, such as macroeconomic stabilization, the police reform, and other areas. But at the same time, they highlighted that many challenges remained still outstanding, and encouraged Ukraine to redouble its efforts. What sort of challenges? Can you give maybe an example of the challenges?
Well, I think we all are following developments in the anti-corruption sphere, in the sphere of judicial reform. Those are really key areas that will make Ukraine much more attractive to foreign investors, and also will hopefully mean that the rule of law will be upheld in a way that is in keeping with Euro-Atlantic best practices.
Well, it's interesting, we speak about this because often people think that NATO is a military alliance, but it's not just that. So, I mean, when we talk about the aspirations for Ukraine, how is NATO preparing, to maybe once Ukraine has met these, to what's the strategy going forward?
I think the focus now is on those reforms that I have outlined. Ukraine, in fact, has a very valuable instrument to get closer to NATO, which is called the Annual National Program. And as you said, it doesn't only cover military and defense issues, but it's much wider than that. It also includes political, economic, legal reforms. And here, the alliance can assist Ukraine based on its wide-ranging experience and expertise. It has, of course, a very wide membership, 29 allies already, who have all gone through different experiences, and their combined expertise can be of real value to Ukraine.
So they help Ukraine in fulfilling all the different requirements and that sort of thing?
Well, it's up to Ukraine to take the hard decisions and to demonstrate the political will to implement tough reforms, because systemic reforms, they're not just about ticking the box, they're real game changers. It's about changing mindsets, and it's about changes in the way that institutions act and interact between them. So it's up to Ukraine to implement those reforms, and we are here to assist with advice and support.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. So that's from Ukraine's perspective, but within NATO itself, I mean, you often travel to Brussels, to the headquarters of NATO, I would imagine. Now, what's the feeling inside NATO of the prospects of Ukraine, maybe not going for membership, but moving closer towards the alliance? I mean, within the alliance states currently, is there a positive idea about this?
Since the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, NATO has demonstrated steadfast support to Ukraine, both political support and practical support. Ukraine's leadership has set itself this very ambitious goal of meeting NATO standards and principles by 2020, and this is what NATO is committed to supporting. We have, of course, had a long-standing relationship with Ukraine, a long-standing partnership. In fact, we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Charter.
Which happened recently, wasn't it? There was an event recently.
Well, there's going to be an event to mark that in July.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We will come back to that. But so throughout these 20-plus years, NATO-Ukraine cooperation has developed, irrespective of the political regime in place in Ukraine, and also irrespective of its foreign policy course. So I think the important thing is to focus on the reform effort now, to make sure that Ukraine can fulfill the goals it has set itself.
Yes, because often there's a lot of maybe scaremongering in not just the Ukrainian media, but the European media. I mean, Donald Trump is rarely out the headlines, and during his presidential election campaign, there were some statements that NATO was obsolete, that that they need to pay their fair share. But how would you analyse those sorts of statements and Ukraine's effort to join the alliance? I mean, is it a good path for Ukraine? Do you want to take that?
Well, I think this question is on two sides, I would say. One is looking at NATO allies and members themselves already, and the discussion about fair burden sharing and increased defense spending has been on NATO's agenda for a couple of years already. And already at both the Warsaw Summit in 2016 and the Wales Summit in 2014, the allies have committed themselves to reverse the negative trend. They have approved a defense pledge to increase the defense spending towards the 2% of the GDP. And the recent meeting in Brussels on 25th of May by all the heads of states and governments have confirmed this commitment again. So when it comes to NATO and NATO allies, the commitment is clearly there. For Ukraine and NATO, as you probably know, we have just welcomed a 29th member to our alliance, Montenegro. So this clearly confirms NATO's open door policy for also the future decades.
Oh, excellent. And I wanted to move on to talk about NATO-Ukraine cooperation. Many of our viewers perhaps don't know the extent of the cooperation. So I was just wondering whether, Mr. Vinnikov, you could speak about this. What sort of projects are NATO involved in Ukraine?
Of course. Indeed, we are often seen as only a defense organization, whereas in fact, of course, we are a politico-military organization, and we are engaged in Ukraine in a wide range of areas. Currently, our focus is on implementing the so-called comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, which was adopted by heads of state and government at the Warsaw Summit last year. And this package contains more than 40 tailored support measures in 13 key areas. So it really is a very complex package to help Ukraine face a complex range of challenges. I would say that the package focuses on two main strands. The first is reform of the security and defense sector, and the second is capacity building and capability development. So to take that forward, we have a range of instruments, including, first of all, the presence of an advisory team here in Kyiv. Our advisors, of 15 of them currently and still growing, they live and work here and are in touch directly with their Ukrainian counterparts in a variety of institutions, not only the Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces, but also the Verkhovna Rada, the Ministry of Social Policy, the National Security and Defense Council, etc. Secondly, we have a range of trust funds in areas like communications, logistics, cybersecurity, medical rehabilitation. Just to give you an example, as part of the Medical Rehabilitation Trust Fund, we have helped treat wounded soldiers from the armed forces, over 150 of them, in allied countries and in Ukraine. We have also worked with 6 medical rehabilitation institutions throughout the country to equip them with state-of-the-art medical rehabilitation equipment. And also, very soon, we will be helping to send the Ukrainian team to participate in the Invictus Games in Toronto.
There's been a lot of publicity about this. Yes,
indeed, which will be happening in September. So you see there's a very wide range of areas. We also have some capacity building programs in the area of defense education, in the area of professional development for civilians, for civil servants, in fact, as well as a building integrity program which tackles corruption in the security and defense sphere.
So there's a lot happening. Actually, we have a short video clip of one of the projects that NATO is involved with in Ukraine. We can take a look now.
So tell me about the strength it took to get through the rehabilitation process.
So that was a clip of one of the rehabilitation programs that NATO is involved in, and that's just one of many. You spoke about cybersecurity as well, and others. But no, the success of NATO, to a certain extent, is based on the perception of the citizens of each alliance or partner country. So how does NATO work in Ukraine to not just promote the organisation, but also its values and the message that it's trying to put across?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very important question for NATO. We strongly believe that a public support to our organization is essential, and it's part of our democratic processes. That's why the leadership of NATO pays a lot of attention to public diplomacy, not only in the member states of the alliance, but also in our partner countries. And 20 years ago already, we paid attention to this because in May 1997, the then Secretary General, Lord Javier Solana, has inaugurated the NATO Information and Documentation Center here in Ukraine, which in fact was the first ever such information office.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Outside of the NATO zone. So our mandate is really to work with Ukrainian public, with Ukrainian citizens, to bring NATO closer to them, to increase their awareness and understanding about our organization. We are aware of a lot of stereotypes and myths about NATO, especially in this part of the world. And our objective is through dialogue and listening to citizens, through outreach programs, to really engage in an open debate.
And I think the outreach programs are very interesting as well, because, as you said, often there is a misperception about NATO, because maybe there are Russian trolls and these users online who just want to spread anti-NATO disinformation or fake news or whatever it may be. So how do you reach out to different organizations, and which organizations do you reach out to actually correct some of these false reports and news?
Well, yes, you are right. Unfortunately, since the illegal annexation of Crimea, we as NATO have experienced quite an increase in disinformation, both in member states but also outside of our borders of the alliance. We are concerned about disinformation because it can, in a long term, erode the confidence of our publics in our democracy and our values. Therefore, we take this issue very seriously. We don't fight propaganda but with facts. Whether it's on air, in print, in TV studios like we are today. We use our own social media to debunk the myths. We work closely with the editors and journalists where we ask for corrections if there is wrong information, or we try to urge them to take the time and fact check and check with us or our member states if the information is correct or not. We also work closely with the European Union. We are sharing information about all the different myths and disinformation that are targeted against our both institutions. And we also are looking at ways how to work together and help partner countries like Ukraine or Moldova, who are also targets of the Russian propaganda, to fight back and counter this negative.
And are there any common myths that are spread online and maybe through traditional media that are about NATO that are actually false? I mean, what sort of examples have you encountered in the past?
Well, we unfortunately have a lot of examples to share.
We need longer for the show, probably.
We would need a separate show just for the myths about NATO. We have obviously a couple of them. For example, the fact that NATO has promised not to expand eastwards to the then leadership of the USSR, or that NATO is purely an instrument of the United States foreign policy, or that the situation in Kosovo and Crimea is basically the same, therefore our arguments about illegal annexation of Crimea don't stand. But if you are interested in the myths, we have a dedicated website at NATO called Setting the Record Straight, where we monitor all these myths, we bring facts, and people can read, watch videos, and learn more about this.
And information is just one platform where you can correct people, but also it's about education about NATO
Absolutely.
as well. And as far as I'm aware, NATO in Ukraine is also involved in study trips. They take Ukrainians. I mean, what can you tell me more about that project, the study trips to Brussels, and what happens there?
So we have two types of projects. One involves projects directly in Ukraine and in the regions of Ukraine, where both Alexander and I and our colleagues travel and meet local journalists, local civil society representatives, because we really believe the dialogue is very important, as you say, to sway away with the disinformation. But we also organize programs of visits to NATO headquarters, be it journalists whom we bring to cover important events, political events like a summit or a ministerial meeting, but also different groups of citizens, be it competition winners, or only recently we brought a group of Ukrainian representatives of the Games of Heroes from the veterans of the NATO zone to NATO headquarters. So we have a very varied program.
Okay, excellent. You said that you have the 20th anniversary, so could you tell us a bit more, Mr. Vinnikov, about the plans that the NATO representative office in Ukraine has to mark this?
Sure. Perhaps you'd like to start with the exhibition and then we can continue with the...
Well, thank you very much. Since we were talking about public diplomacy, so one of the aspects that we thought how to best commemorate 20 years. 20 years is a long time. So we came up with an idea to organize an exhibit about NATO, about Ukraine, about our cooperation, our partnership. So we will welcome everyone to visit our exhibit at the Mistetsky Arsenal as of the 10th of July till the end of July.
Okay. And on the political level, the North Atlantic Council, which is the main decision-making body within NATO, composed of the 29 ambassadors of NATO allies, led by the Secretary General, will also pay a visit to Ukraine soon. And this will be a very significant political event, which will, of course, send a very strong signal of NATO's steadfast support for Ukraine. This will also be, for Ukraine, I think, a very good opportunity to demonstrate the progress it has achieved in implementing reforms, both in security and defense institutions, but also more widely. Because we believe that a strong commitment to these reforms is necessary if Ukraine wishes to meet its goals of implementing NATO standards and principles by 2020.
So, thank you very much for coming into our studio, and hopefully we'll meet again at the 20th anniversary celebrations.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So joining us was Alexander Vinnikov, the head of the NATO representation to Ukraine and the director of the NATO Liaison Office to Ukraine, and Barbara Maronkova, the director of the NATO Information and Documentation Center.